Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Goldstein, and I'm the Director of Day School Programs at Gateways. And I want to welcome you all to our second webinar this year in our series, Our Daughters, Our Future, Exploring Girls' Mental Health and Wellness. Our mission at Gateways is to provide high-quality special education services, expertise, and support to enable students with diverse learning needs to succeed in Jewish educational settings and participate meaningfully in Jewish life. Gateways has expanded our programming in the area of mental health and wellness. Our main goals are to raise awareness, decrease stigma, and provide tools to support our young people who are struggling with mental health illnesses and concerns. We offer educational trainings such as this one. We partner with the Brookline Center for Mental Health to bring mental health clinicians into local Jewish day schools to provide individual therapy to students and offer wellness programming as well. And we have established a bridge program in 2 of the Jewish day schools locally. We are grateful to the Miriam Fund for funding this webinar series. And we are going to be launching right into our topic for tonight, which is mental health among LGBTQ plus youth. So as usual, for anyone who's been to one of our webinars before, following the webinar, you'll receive resources and a survey. We really encourage you to fill out the survey. Your feedback is incredibly helpful to us, and we really like to know what topics you're interested in for future webinars. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rachel Shine, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be with you on this very cold evening. I am thrilled to introduce Jaimie Krass. Jaimie is Keshet's National Director of Youth Programs. She brings a decade of creative curriculum design experience, an innovative spirit, crisis management skills, and boundless energy to the work of building a more just, affirming, and celebratory world for LGBTQ youth. Prior to joining Keshet, Jaimie served as a Hillel campus professional for 7 years. 2 at Muhlenberg College, which we ironically discovered because I also went there, but before Jaimie was there, and 5 at Columbia Barnard Hillel in New York City, creating and leading immersive experiences, reimagining Jewish tradition, and empowering students to seize ownership of their journeys and become leaders in their communities. She received her bachelor's degree in political science and Jewish studies from the University of Florida and her master's in experiential education and nonprofit professional leadership from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Throughout her career and extending back to her teenage years, Jaimie has advocated for LGBTQ justice and inclusion, facilitating trainings at a variety of conferences, JCCs, and synagogues, and creating safe spaces for LGBTQ plus Russian-speaking Jewish teens in Brooklyn. Jaimie is a dedicated crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, a proud Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies alumna, and lives in Manhattan with her wife and their dog, Mishmish. I love that name. We are so thrilled to welcome Jaimie and have her join us today. As usual, you can please put questions in the chat to me or in the Q&A, and I will ask them to Jaimie and facilitate that discussion. So Jaimie, take it away.
Thank you so much. And just want to check, how is the audio? I switched to slightly different mediums. Great. I always feel quite like verklempt when someone reads your full bio. I think I wrote it, a few years ago and updated it because I got married a few months ago. So it's always just so wild to hear it. But thank you so much for bringing me in today. And also thank you everyone for taking the time to be here tonight, for committing to this kind of learning. I know that when I was a teen, if I had known that there were so many adults and so many educators spending their time in this way, it would have made a world of difference. So, and it does make a world of difference to LGBTQ youth today. So thank you so very much. So I will be sharing my screen for a lot of our time together, but not all of it. And so to really kick us off, one moment, computer's being a tiny bit slow, I'll share a little bit more about Keshet and what it is. So first of all, again, for starters, my name is Jaimie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Youth Programs at Keshet. which is an organization that works for the full equality of LGBTQ Jews and our families in Jewish life. And to reiterate that mission, just want to make sure that everything seems nice and visible. Rachel, just want to check, does everything seem good, legible, presentation mode is working okay?
Yes, except it's not like you're sharing your full screen and not presentation mode.
Here we go. Let's see. It's in speaker presenter mode, so this should, I think, work. Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so as I mentioned, Keshet works for the full equality of LGBTQ Jews and our families in Jewish life, and that takes 3 primary programmatic shapes. One is education and training, which entails bringing our professionals into our communities, our educational institutions, to sort of meet everyone at the table and just bring them along on a journey towards fostering more LGBTQ belonging within our communities. The second is community mobilization. So this takes the shape of grassroots as well as national campaigns that are all about forwarding LGBTQ rights. And the third is my favorite, and that's youth programs. So for over a decade now, Keshet has been providing opportunities for LGBTQ Jewish youth to create and participate in community building, learning opportunities together where we can experience that queer and trans euphoria that we so deserve in sacred affinity space. And that primarily takes 2 shapes. One is online programs, which happen every single week and are led exclusively by LGBTQ Jewish youth themselves. And the other is our Shabbatonim. These are weekend retreats. We currently have 2 scheduled for this spring, one on the East Coast and one in the Midwest. East Coast is in March, Midwest is in April. And those 2 are also mostly primarily led by LGBTQ Jewish youth who work on the programming for them for about 6 months. It is my favorite project in the entire world, and I absolutely love it. This is the dream work, and so I'm really excited to get to share a bit with you. I'm also wearing a bit of a different hat tonight, and that is my hat as a Trevor Project crisis counselor. So what that means is each week I volunteer to hold space with LGBTQ youth who are reaching out to the Trevor Project, which provides 24/7 free confidential crisis intervention and suicide prevention counseling services for folks ages 24 and under. I've been doing that for almost 8 years now. And so I'll be drawing on a lot of the Trevor Project's research in some of the content we're going to be learning here together today. So I'd love to start first with some cover notes, some intentions for us in this space. The first and foremost is to have a growth and learning mindset. I already know that's what we're all bringing and that's what we all foster in our communities, but we all recognize that just like identities, learning itself is not linear. And so we're on a journey together. We are continually improving what we understand and know about the world around us. And so we're entering with that flexible, open mind. The second is confidentiality, that we can take lessons from this space, but let's leave the stories and the identifying components that might be related to them, unless we seek the consent of the person who's sharing that in this space. The third is trusting intent and tending to impact. While we won't have many opportunities to interact together tonight, like I'll have opportunities to interact with you and vice versa, but not you so much with each other, it's still important that should someone make a misaction or accidentally make a mistake in how they phrase the question or whatnot, we trust that good intention is there. And we understand that it's also incumbent upon us to tend to the impact should we accidentally cause harm. The fourth is staying present as much as possible. This is an evening. I'm so grateful to you for taking your time out of your evening. And I recognize that you're probably balancing many other responsibilities. So to whatever degree feels feasible, staying present and engaging. This next one is so deeply important, and it's one that I wrestle with all the time in my life, and that is to prepare for non-closure. There is so much we're going to try to explore together today, and we won't get to everything, and we will probably leave with far more questions than answers, but I think that's actually the point. And of course, the conversation does not end here. You can continue to follow up and engage with Gateways or with Keshet in many different ways to continue to enhance our learning. And of course, finally, to have fun as much as possible, again, on a Wednesday night. But we are here to enjoy ourselves, have fun. We're coming at this from really an angle of knowing that this is how we create the liberatory world that LGBTQ youth deserve. All right. So before we dive into first that landscape of LGBTQ mental health, I think it's always really important that we point out that when we're talking about LGBTQ identity, we remember that being LGBTQ is only one facet of someone's identity. We are all very complex people, and the LGBTQ Jewish community is multiracial, comes in with all class backgrounds, of all body types and sizes, of all abilities and disabilities, etc. So as we think about removing barriers, it's important that we make sure that we are accounting for the ways that a diverse LGBTQ population might be experiencing more than one set of barriers at once at a given moment. So we hold on to that and recognize that we're just looking at one important piece of identity, and we don't want to risk erasing all the other pieces of our identities that inform how we're experiencing the world or how we're acting within it at a given time. And I realized I want to pause just to see that that was a lot about Keshet and about Kavanaugh. Were there any questions already that would be helpful for us to cover right now? All right, please let me know if that changes. Okay, so the following quotes, I'm going to share them one by one, and I'm going to invite all of us to engage in a sort of mental exercise together. These are all written testimonials that Keshet received from some of the LGBTQ Jewish teens that we serve through our work. And what I invite us to do is, first, we will read them through. You're welcome to read on your own. I'm also going to read them out loud. And we're going to both listen to what is being said and also be able to create a bit of a picture about what we think might be going on that is also inspiring this testimonial. So the first is, this space means so much to me. Oops, typo, sorry about that. So much to me because I have no other examples of adult, queer, Jewish people of color in my life. When I see elders here, it means that they survived. So initially, we can hear that there's a space that is resonating powerfully with this young person who also does not have any other examples of adult queer Jews of color in their life. And that when they see elders here, when they see adults who hold those identities, it means that they survived. While it's so powerful that we're hearing that this is an affirming space where you are feeling a sense of belonging that you do not feel elsewhere, another takeaway is that there are no other examples that they have encountered in their life of adults who hold those same identities. So one of the primary stressors that a lot of LGBTQ youth experience is that lack of representation and that lack of validation that comes with seeing a potential future for yourself. When you grow up in a world where you don't know what a thriving adult who holds your identities looks like, it's very hard to imagine that future for yourself. And the next testimonial is, I feel like generally Jewish spaces are still unaccepting of queerness, and queer spaces can be unaccepting of Jewishness. So you never truly get a rest because you are on the lookout for homophobia or anti-Semitism either way. But I felt like at the Keshet Shabbaton, I could finally rest, and I haven't been able to do that before. This one is a bit more sort of like upfront and sort of very clear about that experience of needing to leave parts of your identity at the door when you enter a different community space and how painful that is. The words, you never truly get a rest. And I felt like I could finally rest. This is from a 16-year-old trans Jewish teen who lives in Iowa. To be 16 and feel that you have never had a chance to rest because you have always had to either have your guard up in different spaces or be making calculated decisions about which identities you bring into different spaces is so immensely painful and challenging and very much a reality for a lot of LGBTQ Jewish youth and LGBTQ youth in general today. And our final testimonial, I came out to my parents as bisexual 6 years ago and as trans 4 to 5 years ago. They're religious, and my mom uses religion as one of many excuses for why she isn't supportive. I found out about Keshet's Shabbaton 5 years ago, but my mom forbid me from going. Since I'm a legal adult and the Shabbaton was online this year, I was able to attend without her knowing. I am so thankful that I had the chance to surround myself with so much positivity and support. It was a welcome change. This was from a 17-year-old trans teen from the East Coast who participated in our virtual Shabbaton. And what we can hear from this testimonial is the tension that can often be felt and the painful and conflict that can be felt between one's religious identity and one's LGBTQ identity, or between the religious identity that one's parents hold and one's identity as their LGBTQ child. And so what you can hear from this is that there is an erasing experience and there is a lot of dissonance that can happen between that. And additionally, there's that feeling of I am under 18, so I don't have that autonomy and that agency to opt into the spaces that I know will be healthiest for me and most affirming for me. And the other piece that really stood out to me was it was a welcome change. That just sounds so, there's something that is so understated about that, that really speaks volumes about how intense the experience was leading up to that, of knowing that there is an LGBTQ Jewish affinity space for 5 years and not being able to access it until one is 18 years old and has that autonomy. So another very real experience for a lot of LGBTQ youth is that feeling of a lack of support, a lack of understanding, or a lack of affirmation at home or in other areas of one's support system. And then also just being limited by the legal limitations of being under 18 years old. And so really being at the whim of those different forces, whether they are supportive or not. And then before we actually continue, I'll share a little bit about my experience. So while I am not still solidly within our 13 to 24 demographic, that wasn't too long ago. So one of my most visceral memories of my adolescence took place when I was 16. We had just moved from Chicago to Florida, my parents and myself, from Chicago to a very conservative town in Florida. And I was swimming in a pool. And I recall exhaling all of my air and sinking to the bottom of the pool and forcing the bubbles out until I felt like I was just a weight at the bottom of the pool. And I can remember the color of my bathing suit. I can remember the time of day it was, where exactly in the pool I was. And I thought to myself, all of this would stop if I could just find a way to stay down here long enough for me to drown. And I remember thinking that so clearly and trying so hard to see, could I stay down there long enough to drown? And here's now zooming out, here's what was going on at the time. At school, colloquially, constantly, people were throwing anti-LGBTQ slurs at each other, using gay in a derogatory way. People were commenting on each other's behaviors, saying things like no homo, saying things like you're a queer, you're being so homo, all the time. I was surrounded in a political environment that even today we know can be very volatile towards anyone who holds LGBTQ identities. I wasn't out to my parents. In fact, I was only really out to myself for maybe about 2 years at that point, and even that was riddled with anxiety and stress and uncertainty. And this sense of, I must be certain, because to be uncertain is sort of to seal my doom if I do come out and I'm not sure. And I didn't have any other LGBTQ friends. I had just moved to this school. And so I didn't have any affirming community. I didn't know a single LGBTQ adult in my life at that point. And the most I had seen were reflected in Hollywood stories that almost always ended in tragedy and violence. I didn't end up attempting suicide, though I struggled with suicidal ideation for a while after that. But almost on a whim, I can't even remember exactly what inspired it. I got connected with a teacher who was in charge of the diversity club, which was known as the club in our high school, essentially for anyone who was not heterosexual, cisgender, white, Protestant, and of a certain class at the school. And it just so happened that the vast majority of folks who were involved in the club were LGBTQ. So I ended up kind of taking over the club and then campaigning very hard for the next 2 years to create a GSA, an actual gay straight alliance at our school. It was the first one in our county. I did succeed in my senior year of high school. And having that space, meeting in that space every week on a Wednesday, having a teacher who was passionate about holding that space and would stay after hours, and we know that's not compensated, and would stay after hours so that we could hold this space every Wednesday made a world of difference. I'm confident that is the reason that I am still here today. And that is the reason that I became so passionate about LGBTQ rights advocacy. And that led me to the career that I now hold today. So I'm able to say that I'm a thriving lesbian Jewish adult professional because when I was a child, when I was at the bottom of that pool, I somehow was able to reemerge and then engage in affirming space. And so what we are here to do today is we are going to be learning. First, we'll do a bit of a dive again into LGBTQ youth mental health experiences and sort of the landscape of statistics that we receive from some really amazing comprehensive research that exists today and didn't then. And then we're going to really explore how we individually can be that affirming adult presence in a young LGBTQ person's life. I also feel like I must point out that at the time when I was 16, there was a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation being proposed across the US, particularly focused on the issue of marriage equality. While we're all celebrating that the RFMA, the Respect for Marriage Act, was just signed into law by President Biden this week, I also must name that right now, more anti-LGBTQ legislation is being considered across the country than ever before. So while I wish I could say the status quo has changed, it has not. And this is exactly this, it's the same, if not a far more volatile political environment that LGBTQ youth are experiencing today. So thank you for listening and for holding this space while I shared that. And now we're going to dive into some terms. Rachel, was there any questions?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story, and it's really powerful. And please encourage folks to ask questions as we go.
Thank you so much. All right. Oops, sorry. Here we are. Sorry, I'm having a little tech issue. My computer just froze, but we are going to make it work. Thanks for rolling with the punches, everyone. One moment. Hope I'm not too frozen on your end. I know everything is frozen on mine, but I hope you can still somehow hear me.
We can hear you. Can you?
Perfect. I think I can hear you.
All right.
Great. Thanks. I'm sorry about that, everyone. All right. There we go. Sorry to have to restart everything. It's all groovy. Okay. So starting with Statistical Landscape of LGBTQ Youth Mental Health. And we're primarily drawing on a few of the most comprehensive surveys out there. One of them is the GLSEN, the Gay and Lesbian Student Education Network School Climate Survey. And the other is an annual survey that the Trevor Project conducts of over 30,000 LGBTQ youth respondents based in the United States. It is the most comprehensive survey of its kind. This first statistic that I'll read out loud is from a survey that actually applies to overall youth, not specifically LGBTQ youth. And you'll see that on the next few slides that the top bullet will be a data point that is drawn from surveys that focus on overall youth mental health experience, not focus on LGBTQ youth. So in 2019, 33% of high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And persistent feelings is typically defined as feeling this way for at least 2 weeks, if not more. And you'll see that that definition is actually mentioned more explicitly in the second data point, which is from the Trevor Project survey. In 2019, 71% of LGBTQ plus youth reported feeling sad or hopeless for at least 2 weeks in the past year. I just want to point out that difference again, 33% of youth overall, 71% when we specifically zoom in on LGBTQ youth. Recent research covering 80,000 youth globally found that depressive and anxiety symptoms doubled during the pandemic, with 25% of youth experiencing depressive symptoms and 20% experiencing anxiety symptoms. That's overall not focused on LGBTQ youth. 72% of LGBTQ youth reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in the past 2 weeks, including more than 3 in 4 transgender and non-binary youth. 62% of LGBTQ youth reported symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past 2 weeks, including more than 2 in 3 transgender, and non-binary youth. Another heavy statistics, there's a few more that I would love to share in this space. 15% of youth overall seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, from a survey in 2020. From a survey in 2022, 45% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. And within that, 40% of trans people attempt suicide by the age of 25. 47% of Black LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And over 70% of Orthodox Jewish LGBTQ youth who reached out to JQI, one of our wonderful collaborators and partners in this work, in 2019 reported thoughts of suicide. I want to draw our attention to those bulleted statistics because, as we mentioned before, the context of the other identities really matters in terms of understanding someone's experiences in the world. And so we can see that there are times when that's very compounded. So 70% is quite different, even than that sky-high 47% of Black LGBTQ youth. Now, we may be asking ourselves, why? Why is this the mental health experience of so many LGBTQ youth? And while there isn't just one answer, in fact, there are many answers, I do want to draw our attention to what research shows us about the lived experiences of LGBTQ youth today, understanding that this will play a direct role in a young person's mental health. 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth report that they have been physically threatened or harmed in their lifetime due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. 29% of LGBTQ youth have experienced homelessness, been kicked out, or run away. 6 out of 10 LGBTQ youth said that someone attempted to convince them to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. 75% of transgender youth report that they feel unsafe at school. Nearly 20 to 40% of homeless youth are transgender. I want to take a pause because I know this can feel like a lot. And I know every time I read something like this, it really lands hard, especially because there are a number of statistics that very much apply to my own story. And I wish I could say that the world was drastically different than it was when I was a teenager. And this is why this work is so important and why we feel so much commitment and urgency around it. It is why so many of us are here tonight participating in this webinar, because we understand that when we say there's a lot at stake, we're saying that lives are at stake, and they truly are. And there's power in being affirming. So these are some statistics that I want to share now about how much power we actually have as individuals to make a difference. So 78% of LGBTQ youth report having access to at least one in-person LGBTQ affirming space. And there was a very, very positive relationship between youth who have access to this space and their decreased sense of their decreased experience of suicidal ideation, let alone suicide attempts. 86% of LGBTQ youth report having high levels of support from at least one person. And then perhaps one of the most important pieces that we can consider, having just one affirming adult in their lives who uses the correct name and pronouns reduces a trans person's risk of attempting suicide by over 56%. Imagine if that's not just one adult, but that's 2, 3, 10, 20 adults.
Jaimie, we did get one question about whether or not you have specific stats on self-injury or non-suicidal self-injury, so self-harm in this population. My response was that typically the stats we see are around suicidal ideation, and self-harm is encompassed in that. I didn't know if you had additional statistics.
Yes, so the Trevor Project has not measured self-harm in all of its surveys, but there was a survey, I believe it might have been from 2018, and I can pull up the direct statistic that does consider it separate, because a lot of self-harm is actually not associated with suicidal ideation. It's often a coping mechanism, whether that's to cope with feelings of numbness, feelings of being out of control, or just feelings of overwhelm. And so, and that number is quite high. I think if I'm recalling correctly from 2018, it was close to, if not perhaps even over 50%. And I know that that was part of my experience growing up. And there are a number of teens too within our network who have shared experiences with self-harm. I would say in my experience as a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project too, self-harm is mentioned very often in my conversations with youth. Often again as a coping mechanism, and not so much from that angle of suicidal ideation and acting on suicidal ideation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think, and the same is with the statistics from the Human Rights Campaign, which is another place where we typically get statistics that they similarly, it's similar to what you had just mentioned. So another question was regarding the one affirming adult. Is this an adult who is close to the child or just random adults?
So the research study did not make a distinction between whether or not they were close. What I'm imagining is this would be someone that would at least have some form of regular contact with a youth. I believe the survey had measured the number of times that someone was experiencing this kind of affirmation from that one adult, and that's where they got the sort of emphasis on who uses the correct name and pronoun. So that's a consistent use of correct name and pronoun can be is associated, and the Trevor Project is starting to touch upon this too, is associated with a very significant decrease in suicide attempts.
Great. Thanks,
I don't
Jaimie.
think they have drawn, I don't recall them drawing whether or not there is a decrease in suicidal ideation overall, but given that 40% of 40% attempting by the age of 25, I think that's where that's what drove that focus on wanting to see what's the impact on suicide attempts.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So now we're going to focus a little bit more on some basic terms and concepts. And I do welcome any questions, any clarifying questions. And of course, I'll pause too to invite you to share any other terms that you feel you'd want to see reflected in the ones that we're going to cover. And just so you know, I'm going to pull up and see if the latest Trevor Project survey, which was just released not too long ago, it contains any new statistics about self-harm. All right, so when we talk about LGBTQ identities, we're talking about 3 different axes, and each of these areas is entirely dependent of the other 2, and they can occur in any combination. So I'm going to focus first on sex assigned at birth. So this is the category of male, female, or intersex that someone else, typically a doctor, assigns to a person at or before birth, often based on how they interpret that person's body or their external anatomy. So you can see here, we've written female, intersex, and male. All of these categories have a very wide range within them. And in fact, about 1 to 1.5% of the population have bodies that defy the binary either or category of male or female. And this is called being intersex. So being intersex is not itself a medical problem, but too often people, and especially the medical community, treat it as if it is something that is wrong. And they try to fit intersex people, or often fix intersex folks by applying different medical procedures so that they can better fit into the categories of male and female. And many members of the intersex community consider themselves as part of the LGBTQ community, as both communities are working for bodily autonomy and resisting the notion that someone else's assumptions about a person's body or gender should be allowed to cause harm. And for a comparison, that 1 to 1.5%, that's about as common as redheadedness. So being intersex is about as common as redheadedness. Not uncommon at all. Now looking a little bit more closely at gender identities. So this is a person's internally held sense of self as it relates to gender. I like to say that this is something that you feel, or maybe you eventually come into a sense of feeling in your kishkis, in your soul. A person develops this self-knowledge over time, and it does not need to be proven to or by anyone else. And gender identity is separate from gender stereotypes or assumptions, which we're going to be talking about later too. I'm happy to explain some of the terms within here, but I'd really rather use my time to meet you where you're at. So I'm wondering, does anyone have any questions or is seeking any definitions of the terms that you currently see on the screen underneath gender identity. And of course, typing takes a while, so if they come up a little bit later, that is okay. Oh, I think we have a question.
Yes. Can you define genderqueer?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked. So genderqueer often refers to genders that are not part of that man-woman binary. This is a term that's sometimes used by people who actively play with their gender in ways that are meant to critique or undermine the binary system. And again, what I think is a really important sort of takeaway with these terms is that while we can try to understand our own sort of definitions for them, what matters most is that we respect whatever definitions the person who's using those words to describe themselves is using. These words mean whatever they mean to the people who are actively using them. And I think I see some other questions.
Yes, agender.
Agender, thank you for asking. Agender typically refers to not having a gender, or for some people, having a gender that is totally neutral. A comparable word when we get over to the sexual orientation axis is asexual.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you all so much for the wonderful questions. Now, it's worth saying a word about the connection between gender identity and sex assigned at birth here, which you can see we try to,
what pronouns would agender use?
Thank you so much for asking. So pronouns, the pronouns that a person uses is actually not always informed by their gender identity. Anyone who holds any gender identity might want to use different pronouns. So for example, someone could identify as genderqueer and still go by the pronouns she, her. Someone could identify as gender fluid and still go by the pronouns he, him. A person who can use they, them pronouns and identify as non-binary or identify as a trans man or a trans woman. So a person who is agender would use whatever pronouns they end up telling us that they use. And we're going to actually do a deeper dive into not only the pronouns that I just mentioned, but some neo pronouns too, which are pronouns that are not he, him, she, her, they, them. They would use, so it's always best to check in. Even if someone provides us the most comprehensive definition of their gender identity, we still don't actually know what pronouns they use until they tell us. Really fabulous question. Thank you so much for asking. So these two axes here with sex assigned at birth and gender identity are totally independent of one another, and there are often societal assumptions or structures that show up differently for people depending on the relationship between these two. So let's look at the word cisgender. Cisgender comes from the root cis, which means on the same side. So a person might describe themselves as cisgender if their gender identity happens to be the same as what was assigned to them at birth. So for example, I'm a cisgender woman. I was born, the doctor said it's a girl, and I continue to identify as a girl and as a woman. Of course, there were also moments where I was kind of questioning that. And that's the identity that I hold and that I feel comfortable describing myself as today. Transgender comes from the root trans, which means across or beyond. So a person might describe themselves as transgender if their gender identity happens to be something other than what was assigned to them at birth. And some folks who are non-binary and genderqueer people identify as transgender and some do not, and both are valid. And regardless of whether or not a person considers the identities to overlap, it's important to just be in coalition together when dealing with structures, stereotypes, and marginalization. And I will also pause because I know this is a lot and I'd love to hear if there are any questions. I'm also curious if anyone wants to share any gender identity related terms that you don't see up here on this diagram. All right. Oh, I think we have a question. Do teens tend to question more than adults in terms of self-identifying? There is such a gap in research of adults when it comes to exploring questioning of identity. And I am very sad that that exists. It's so much of the most comprehensive identities measuring experience of LGBTQ identity, comprehensive surveys measuring experiences of LGBTQ identity do not include adults. Especially adults who might not be actively identifying as LGBTQ, but are questioning. So in terms of visibility, I think there's more visibility of teens questioning than there is visibility and representation of adults questioning.
Yeah,
and I think what has also changed is that there's more language available for youth nowadays, thanks to the internet, as one of the main contributors to that, to be able to use those tools to articulate that questioning. Please, Rachel.
I think it's also partly about expectation, right? Adolescence is a time when we expect that teens, there's some level of exploration, and in adults, there's an expectation that things are more, that identity is more solidified based on development. And so teens are almost more welcome to engage in the exploration process than adults are. And it's certainly, they're in settings where it's more commonly talked about for many individuals if they're in an affirming environment.
And we need to shake this up. I would love to hear so many more adults talking about their relationships today with their sexuality and their gender identities. So now, as you'll see, I've added the terms underneath sexual orientation, and I actually just want to zoom in a little bit on the term queer, because you'll notice this shows up on both the gender and orientation sides of the triangle, and that's intentional, because queer is a word that is fundamentally about defying categorization and limitations. It means something different to each person who uses it. And with that, while I use the term queer liberally when talking about my own life or some of my own favorite pieces of LGBTQ culture, some things that are really important to keep in mind are, for some people, the word queer is used to describe identities that cannot be captured by a single one of the terms that are on this axis, this triangle here. And so that word queer may reflect the complexity, both in terms of gender identity and in terms of sexual orientation. And for others, it is purely about sexual orientation. For some, it reflects a particular political or ideological approach to gender and or sexuality, and usually relating to critiquing or resisting systems of power and expectations that have been woven in to our culture's understanding of gender and sexuality. Some people use it as an umbrella term for everyone who is not cis and straight. And I typically do not recommend this because queer has a loaded history as a reclaimed word, and it has its origins as a slur. And while so many people, and even myself personally included, experience empowerment when it comes to reclaiming this word, for a lot of other folks, there's a very real pain associated with it. So it's just deeply important that we respect the autonomy and identities of people and only use the words that they are using for their identities. Were there any questions about the terms that are here underneath sexual orientation? Or any other questions about the terms here? And of course, this is not the most comprehensive list. In fact, in the Trevor Project survey last year, underneath the category gender identities, the teens who were participating in the survey offered more than 106 different gender identities. And we have 6 up here. All right, we're going to keep moving forward. Now we're going to zoom in even more on gender identity and some terms related that we can then use to help us navigate being an affirming presence. The first was what I mentioned, gender identity. You feel it in your kishkis. It's your inner self knowledge and understanding of the genders with which you identify. It cannot be externally decided or interpreted. Gender expression, which is external or a comportment related to, is the manner in which we outwardly express, signal, or perform our genders. So that can encompass appearance, clothing, hair, voice, mannerisms, a whole manner of different things. And of course, it's also very dependent on the cultural context in which we're functioning. Some behaviors might be associated with a particular understanding of gender expression in one culture and the opposite in another, which is where we get to gender roles and stereotypes, which are those culturally specific expectations, pressures, and assumptions related to gender that are imposed on the people who are in that culture. And if we were all able to unmic, I always find it so meaningful to ask folks about what are the different gender roles and stereotypes that you've experienced or that you feel are still very prominent and prevalent today. And you're welcome to share a few. And if we end up having a little bit of time, I'd love to visit those together, especially when we get to the sort of more active allyship part of our time together. And the fourth is gender attribution. So this is that process by which we perceive another person and use our own assumptions or past experiences, or like we mentioned, that cultural context, to guess which gender that person holds. So that's when we look at someone and our mind says that's a woman, and that's how we then perceive them. And attributions made in this way cannot be assumed to be accurate. I mean, you might feel like you're guessing, and you might be right. You might look at me and think she's a woman, and you would be right. But imagine the harm if you were wrong, and the erasure if you were wrong. This is the kind of internal cognitive mechanism that informs our behavior that we are working so hard to unlearn. And there's a lot that helps us learn it to begin with. But unlearning it means that we can really show up and respect the person who is in front of us and show them the dignity that they deserve. Any questions about these terms that are on the screen right now? And I'm just switching because this is a visual representation that I'll share of those same terms while you type any questions. So if we look in the middle, that's sort of gender identity. That's like this figure, this internal understanding, this, you know it in your kishkas, gender expression, that external communication of your gender identity. And then something that is totally outside, that is not dictated by you and your gender identity, is the gender roles and stereotypes of your cultural context. And then also externally, folks' gender attribution, the way that folks are perceiving and making assumptions about your gender identity. Any questions about these concepts? And of course, it's never too late. So take all the time you need to type, and we will make sure to create space. Let's hold on to these terms super lightly, y'all, because there is a vast galaxy of identity out there. As I mentioned, over 106, or at least 106 different gender identities mentioned in the Trevor Project surveys fill in the space by youth who are participating. So there's no expectation that we're all going to memorize all of these terms. And we're not presenting them as a sort of like taxonomy by which one person can categorize others. These are really just definitions, terms, tools that we can use to be a better listener when we're in community with others. And so that we can use this awareness to identify and remove barriers to access in all of our spaces and barriers to belonging in all of our spaces. And I see there's a question. Is the gender identity and the way it's expressed usually parallel? Do you want to share, Rachel?
Oh, no, I was going to read it to you. So
thank you. Thank you. For once, I was able to relatively eloquently see this question. So what we do know is that currently it seems like the majority of humans, like let's just look at the US, identify as cisgender. What we don't actually have comprehensive research about how folks express that gender. So I think it really kind of depends on the person, because it also, we constantly have these fluctuating notions of what gender expressions are associated with different gender identities, right? So there was a time when, this was actually not too long ago, in the 1920s, when pink was considered a hypermasculine color and was not expected or accepted to be worn so often by people who are girls or women. We also see this with pants playing a different role in terms of like the gender identities that they were associated with, or the gender identities that someone would attribute to you. And if we're thinking a bit more about LGBTQ history, in fact, the raid on Stonewall in 1969, the police raids that were conducted in the 60s and even way earlier on these LGBTQ hubs were often fueled by a law that said that you must be wearing at least 3 items of clothing that matched your gender identity. Which, what does that mean? I can have short hair and I can wear overalls or a tuxedo and still feel that that is an accurate representation of my cisgender woman, an accurate expression of my cisgender woman identity. So it's less about a trend and it's more about, there's just constant fluctuating understandings of what someone's gender expression says about their gender. And that's why we can't actually interpret someone's gender based on their expression. Gender expression is about you feeling like you're expressing yourself in a way that's authentic to who you are and what your gender is. It is not actually about how other people interpret, though sometimes we seek that validation from others that we hope we will receive by expressing our gender identities in a particular way. It's complicated, but it's also really exciting and beautiful. I hope that touches a little bit on like the maximum fluidity that just exists around gender expression, gender identity, and also who tends to do what. And what does that mean in a given context? Really beautiful question. I feel like we can have such a Talmudic discussion about this, and I hope one day we get a chance to. Now I want to do a check-in, and this is where you can flood the Q&A with how you're feeling about the terms and concepts that we just covered. So number one is if you're feeling like you're in the very beginning stages of familiarity with these terms, and that's wonderful. That means you have so much space to grow into. And then 5 being, I feel quite confident, quite familiar with these terms and concepts. And you can feel free to share in the Q&A or share directly with Rachel or with Sharon where you're feeling at on a scale of 1 to 5.
You put it in the Q&A or the chat, either one.
Great.
4.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very familiar. 5. A lot of several 5s.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
4.5.
Wonderful.
Love it.
This is wonderful and so exciting. And this also means that now we can take our familiarity and our sense of comfort with these terms and extract that familiarity and apply it to what we can do as educators, as adults who are in young people's lives today. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So exciting. We love all those blossoming trees. And I'm trying to get rid of the chat. Ugh, I can't exit because it's in the way. There we go. All right. Okay, so now when we're talking about supporting and advocating for LGBTQ plus youth, what are we talking about? I love rooting things in Jewish texts. I'm fortunate enough that I studied at JTS for a time and at Pardes, and that really imbued me with a sense of passion for text. So the sages have taught us that study is greater than action, but only because study leads to action. This is what we mean by having that learning mindset. We need to constantly be opening ourselves to learning opportunities if we really want to show up. And the reason we want to do that is because then we'll be able to ask ourselves and hopefully answer this question. Every time you go through something and it's easy for you, look around and say, who is it not easy for? And what can I do to dismantle that system? So the first framework that we're going to be talking about when it comes to how to identify and then work on those barriers to belonging and to access is the framework of unspoken norms and systems. And specifically, with respect to the LGBTQ community, these unspoken norms and systems are called cisnormativity and heteronormativity. So cisnormativity is that often unspoken assumption that cisgender identities are the norm or default. So this means that we're talking about cisnormative systems are those that benefit cisgender people and disadvantage transgender or non-binary people. And it's important that we know that cisnormativity is not the same as being cisgender or being straight or fitting stereotypes even about these identities. This isn't really about identity. These are terms that we're using to talk about systems. Programs, paperwork, the assumption that being cis or straight is the norm, the assumptions that we'll draw about someone's lifestyle based on our sort of cisnormative understandings or systems. Heteronormativity is that often unspoken assumption that straight identities are the norm or default. So these are systems that benefit straight people and disadvantage LGBTQ people. So for example, I am married, and when I mention to someone that I got married 3 months ago, I'm often asked, what does your husband do? And then I explain that my wife is a rabbi. And then I'm like, oh my God, if I could just imagine my grandparents, may they rest in peace with this. She married a rabbi, probably a little different than what they expected. But I think they would be, I hope they would be felon. And I see there's a question.
Yes. So somebody shared that also under cisnormativity are gendered bathrooms.
I would actually love to hear even more examples of cisnormativity and heteronormativity. So that one was perfect. Gendered bathrooms that are often focused on a gender binary of there being male bathrooms, female bathrooms. Any other examples of cisnormativity or heteronormativity? Another is that, dear sir or madam, ladies and gentlemen, this assumption that there is this or that.
Yes, teachers addressing a class as boys and girls, gendered gifts at B'nai Mitzvot. I
Oh,
always,
gender gifts at McDonald's.
yeah, how we're called to the Torah, bar and bat mitzvah. And an example I always think about is how envelopes are addressed, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so.
Mr. and Mrs., husband and wife.
Yeah.
Assumptions around you talking to someone and saying, oh, make sure you tell your husband, make sure you tell your wife the assumptions you're making that are also based on your gender attribution of that person. So that's where those two really coincide. And I love that you mentioned how we're called to the Torah, because there's some beautiful language, especially through the non-binary Hebrew project too, that offers more affirming options for calling someone to the Torah, like na la'amod. Or instead of saying bat from bat a certain person or ben a certain person, mi beit from the house of, mi mishpachat from the family of. There's such amazing, beautiful work going on, but those are such powerful examples. And in terms of heteronormativity too, coming out itself, the notion that you have to come out as anything, same with cisnormativity, the notion that there needs to be a process of coming out, because the assumption is you aren't unless you say you are. And that was one of the most painful parts for me, was this notion of feeling like there was already a lot of unspoken positive reinforcement to be straight. And then that filling me with fear about, okay, well, what's going to happen when they find out the truth? You can keep giving examples too, because they'll probably be really helpful when we're going to be working on some skill building in just a little bit. So if you think of more examples of heteronormativity and cisnormativity, please feel free to share them. Why these systems are so harmful is very much captured in this beautiful comic here, which I'll give folks a moment to read, and I'll also read it out loud. So this is a person with a heavy backpack whose thoughts are saying, everyone reacts to being misgendered differently. Every time I'm misgendered, it feels like someone is adding a brick to my backpack. As the day goes on, there are more and more bricks. By the end of the day, I feel like I am slowly being crushed by the seemingly unending burden of the gender binary. One little interaction could feel like something that we can just move away from. But when it's one little interaction after another, after another, after another, after another, repeated from so many different angles, it's crushing.
So a really good question for you. How does one as an educator respond to a parent who says, well, there are way more straight kids than there are gay kids, so why can't we say boy and girl, etc.?
That kind of, I think that we hear a lot of that kind of pushback in so many different spaces. And I think what I strive to remind folks is, when we do address people using more affirming language like y'all, or everyone, or students, friends, chevre, kahila, kadosha, chavarim, when we use more inclusive, actually chavarim is gender, so I would probably gear more towards chevre. But when we use more inclusive, less gendered language, no one gets hurt. No one gets erased. When we do use boy and girl, even if the only people who are getting hurt are a minority, someone's getting hurt. And not only are those people getting hurt, but we are modeling a society that we could just do better.
Yeah, and I find actually now, because I've become so accustomed to saying like y'all, even though I'm from New York, and also partner instead of spouse or husband or wife or whatever, when I use gender specific language, it feels strange, right? It feels strange. And I have come to say to parents often, if you are more comfortable, I explain about being inclusive and not hurting anyone and kind of the dialogue that you use. And that I will say to parents, if you are more comfortable using X, Y, and Z terms, that is absolutely your choice. You can do what you feel most comfortable with. And in my office or my workspace or in this agency, these are the terms that we use because we strive to be as inclusive as possible.
That's so beautiful, because it's also about having consent of the people you're in community with in that particular space. So there are some folks there are some people that I can be around. I have a group of lovely friends who all identify as men, and they love when I say ladies to the group. Like, it is something we have. I have their consent, and it is a part of what we find a very affirming and warm environment. So that's also about, like, in this space, you have my consent to use this inclusive language. In your space, you might give me consent to refer to everyone as guys or as boys and girls. But unless we are mindful and understand that everyone is receiving that in that affirming, not harm-causing way, I think it's better to function from the side of healing than harm. And
100%.
it's hard, and we can do hard things, and we're going to make mistakes, and that is okay. In fact, part of the learning and part of the undoing of all these systems is making those mistakes and figuring out how to navigate when we do that. So as you just mentioned too, there's so much power in language, and we learn from Proverbs that death and life are in the power of the tongue, and that's because we know that words have the power to be life affirming or deeply damaging. We harken back to that statistic about understanding that a trans person's risks of attempting suicide decrease by over 56% if one person uses the affirming name and pronouns. That's such power in using affirming language. Here's some more examples, which we were just being touched on, and I would love to hear more, especially if you have examples of ones that you like to use in your own educational settings. But avoiding these top terms, which are very gendered: ladies, gentlemen, ma'am, girl, sir, guys. So guys, we recognize that sometimes some folks find it really affirming to be referred to in like a collective like that. So I know that one kind of brings up a lot for folks. I prefer to avoid it, and I use y'all instead. There's all these options here: folks, everyone, friends, all. What other examples of more affirming choices that we can incorporate into our language? Great, and I'll open that. Oh, and I see a wonderful question. How do you recommend helping very young children use affirming language? They already absorb so much of the institutional binary language. They absorb it so much to the degree that often folks, a lot of research, like pretty compelling research, says that by kindergarten, many youth are already developing a strong sense of self in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation. And as early as 3 and 4 are really developing the schema around how our society is understanding gender identities and sexual orientation. So here's what we would do is I would approach it the same way that I would if they were using any other terms that weren't really like respectful or like mindful of folks' dignity. So for example, if you found that let's say you have 4 sons who have expressed to you that they identify as sons, as boys, and you have 1 daughter, and let's say the daughter repeatedly refers to the sons as ladies, and maybe like the daughter is like 2 and just calls them ladies, and they get kind of annoyed by it, reminding her, hey, actually that's not inclusive. Like the way that you might explain it, actually those are your brothers, not your sister. Let's say she's referring them, these are my sisters, and you would say, oh, those are your brothers, because that's how their brothers want to be referred to. Correcting that of just, oh, that's your brothers. I think these reminders of, oh, remember when we say guys, we actually want to say y'all, or we actually want to say folks. And you don't have to get into the gritty of, because we don't know who someone's gender is. I think correcting it in a way that is easily understandable of, oh, actually in this space, remember, we use friends instead of girls or instead of guys. Remember, in this space, we use chevre. In this space, we use kehila to refer to a group of people. Just those kind reminders. And if a young person says, why? We say, well, in this space, we like to use language that makes everyone feel good or everyone feel seen. When do you feel good? What names do you like to be called that make you feel good? And they might engage, or they might be like, okay, I'm done. I want to go play now. I got it. And I'm going to need some reminders. So we would approach it the same way that we find that folks correct language for straight and cisgender identities. So the ways that, for example, in a lot of different stories, there's an abundance of examples about sexuality and gender identity, like saying, this is a picture of 2 girls, or in this family, there is a mom and a dad. I'm so sorry, I almost said a mom and a mom. I forgot for a second what the more sort of cis heteronormative version was for a second. There is a mom and a dad. It's great to provide them with other examples, like in this family, there are 2 moms. In this family, there are 2 dads. In this family, there are 2 non-binary parents. And being able to provide those examples will help that language start to feel more authentic to them. Those kind reminders of, in this space, we use this. Remember, we say this. That's what we find to be the most effective. And at the same time, your space might be the only space where they're experiencing that kind of affirming instruction. So it could be that there are an abundance of reminders needed. And it could be that there are spaces where that's being challenged in different ways. And that's where I think approaching it from that place of abundant, diverse examples is already helping them gain that heightened sense of visibility of a diverse world. And that will be built upon year after year, hopefully within that educational institution. And it takes a village, and it's not easy. I hope that helps answer. But we typically, like, we wouldn't necessarily go into diving into what trans identities are, what non-binary identities are, because that might feel far too complex for a 4 or 5-year-old to remember. So we'd approach it the same way we'd correct them with other language faux pas that they make. And please feel free to comment or add more if you have additional questions, or if that just stirred up more for you. I'd love to hear. And if there are any other examples too of alternatives to that gendered language we can use, I'd love to hear them. One of the most spectacular benefits of being on Zoom so often is that we're directed in so many more spaces, or encouraged in so many more spaces, to share our pronouns. And we're seeing this so much amongst even our youngest participants, of them already having them baked into their Zoom profiles. And so why is it important to share pronouns? For you individually, it allows others to refer to you correctly. It also just by the existence on this screen right now, challenges the assumption for other folks that we can or should guess people's pronouns. And again, you might be right. You might look at me and refer to me as she, and you would be right. And imagine the harm if you were wrong. If you're a person whose pronouns are regularly respected by others, like me, sharing your pronouns takes the burden off of those whose pronouns are regularly disrespected to be the first and only ones sharing. So for example, whenever I'm in a space, I introduce myself and I share my pronouns, because I do not and cannot know if anyone else in that space is actually not used to having their pronouns respected. And in order to receive that respect, would need to be the only person sharing their pronouns to remind folks. So I'd rather engage in that practice so that it kind of can become a bit of the norm of the space. And at the same time, we at Keshet strongly advise against requiring or demanding the sharing of pronouns, because doing so can be really harmful to people who are not out. It can be harmful to folks who are actively exploring their identities, folks who are feeling really unsure, and many others. So, and by framing it as a demand, can also trigger that defensiveness among those who are just struggling with the concept of sharing pronouns, or the concept of not being able to accurately assume people's pronouns. And that can have negative consequences for the folks that we are all actually here seeking to support, and negative consequences for those individuals on their own learning journeys. So, and that's not the same as allowing others to belittle the idea. It's worth responding with some of these like reasons why sharing pronouns benefits so many people. It really benefits everyone. And we got to give folks the time and space to be able to try on the idea. I see that's a question.
Yes, it's sharing more. Somebody shared, I always think of the Jewish Passover Seder and the story of the 4 sons. We answer the 4 sons or children the way they can each understand at their own ages, which is maybe the way we as educators can explore this with children at age appropriate levels as they grow developmentally.
Elizabeth, that is so beautiful. And it also reminds me of another piece of the Exodus story where when we are all at Sinai receiving the Torah, we receive it lefi kocho, according to our kocho, our ability, whatever koch means in that context. We receive it according to our ability, our might, wherever we are at. There is so much individualistic, sort of constructivist, learner-centered language in our liturgy and in our tradition. And I think that is so beautiful what you just shared, that should be the guiding compass of this work too, of really meeting folks where they are at and focusing on the person in front of us. That's why we say we don't want to get lost in the terms as some sort of taxonomy for categorizing folks. What really matters is the person who's in front of us and what they need. Thank you so much for sharing that. Wanted to share this fun little chart because it shares a couple neo-pronouns. Neo meaning new, pronouns, so basically pronouns that are not she, her, they, them, and he, him. You can see some examples here in the lower right corner of using these. And I'll pause in case you wanna read through. And these are just like a wonderful examples of linguistic evolution. especially with they, them, theirs. This is an example of linguistic evolution in which an existing term like has expanded its meaning to meet the need of the people who speak that language. And it can be, and I know like for a lot of folks, it can be like a challenge. They feel like their grammar systems that they've been learning their whole lives are really fighting against the adoption of this, of using they, them in a singular way. And like we said before, we can do hard things and we can unlearn a lot of that. And it's worth it. It's so worth it. So now that we've practiced a little bit of some of that affirming language, we're going to actually think more about not just the affirming language we use in terms of our words, but also in terms of our relational language, in terms of our presence and our body language, ways to respond to someone who comes out to you. At the first, I feel like from that first moment, it's important that we're really listening to what coming out means to them. Sometimes we can feel an instinctual need to say, I don't care. Oh, it doesn't matter to me. It's no big deal. But to them, it might actually be a really big deal. And they might want to feel that you understand that this is a big deal. So that framework for listening is really to just to seek to affirm and meet that tone where they're at and how they're expressing to them. And I think one of the best ways to do it is to say mazel tov if they're coming out in general and not just and to you, or if they're coming out like in their community and their family, to congratulate them and say mazel tov and recognize that that takes a lot of bravery to do. We don't yet live in a world where people aren't making the opposite assumptions about who we are. And that's really awesome that you, and I like to say, not just that you came out, but that you brought me in. Because I like to feel that it's not that I'm coming out to anyone, I'm bringing them into a deeper sense of knowing who I am. This is not about me coming out of some prison. This is about me bringing you into a rainbow and wonderful world that I get to move through every day. Thanking someone for sharing carries so much weight. I find with teens especially, I don't know how many teens are quite accustomed to folks thanking them for sharing of themselves and thanking them for existing. But thanking someone for, thank you for letting me know, holds so much weight. Centering the need of the person coming out to you can be one of the most challenging things to do, especially if it's, say, someone where it's your own child, or there's any other host of sort of internal responses that you kind of feel yourself just having. And I'm going to actually share them a little bit more on the next slide. Centering their need is the most important thing. It's less about, okay, but wait, what does that term mean? Wait, I didn't know that you could be this and that at the same time. Let's listen to what they're actually seeking from us in this moment. Let's listen to what they're bringing us into. A kind of talkless piece, a logistical piece that is so important, especially for educators, especially when we're working with youth that are not necessarily in our household, though also just as important there too, finding out whether or not this information is confidential. Who else knows about this, or what would feel good for you in terms of privacy about this? Is this something that you'd like me not to share with others? I know you shared with me that you'd like me to use they, them pronouns when referring to you. Are there some contexts that I shouldn't be using those? Should I be using they, them when I'm talking about you to your parents? Or is there a different set of pronouns you'd like me to use? What name would you like me to use when I'm talking with your parents? Or what name would you like me to use when I'm talking with other administrators or faculty members? Checking in about confidentiality is key, and also really empowers the young person in their autonomy over being able to come out on their own terms and at their own pace. Checking in too, not just in that moment of after they've shared this with you, asking them, how are you feeling? Like, I know we've been talking to this, and I know like you shared something that I'm really honored that you shared with me, and I just want to know, how are you feeling? And that could also be checking up with them in another situation too, of, hey, I know you mentioned that you were planning to come out to your parents. I'm just curious, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And Rachel, I think there was another question, right?
Yeah, somebody just commented that it's really great advice regarding confidentiality. And I think the one thing that, is also important to remember is that sometimes people are coming out in different ways to you, like that you don't even know that they're coming out, right? Like, say somebody just starts talking about their partner and they start using same gendered pronouns as they might be. And it's like, okay. And they're looking probably for how your response is going to be. And so I always, my kind of response to that is always that I'm going to respond the same way, regardless of what pronouns they're using for their partner, because then they know, like, okay, this is a person that I can trust. And so, oh, tell me about him, her, whatever they use, and meeting, like, you want to meet that person where they are.
You want to match that tone. And it, like, in that moment, they're not seeking validation or affirmation in terms of, I want you to tell me that you affirm me, but they're just seeking to have a conversation and know that they're welcome in the space, that there's belonging there. That when I casually mentioned my wife, while it would be hilarious if you said Mazel Tov at this point to me for coming out, I would honestly love it. And I'm sure when I was like, there are also many people who would not. I love shtick and anything that's loud and silly. But yeah, it would be kind of confusing. So you're right. There's very different ways. And also, honestly, it's a lifelong journey too. So there isn't just one moment of coming out. Not only as we just develop deeper understandings of our identities, and so we might come out in different ways with different sort of ways that we're describing our identities, but also just so many different spaces until cisnormativity and heteronormativity are not the dominant systems in our society. Coming out tends to be a lifelong journey that is repeated at so many different points. So ways not to respond when someone comes out to us and why. It's so important that we don't downplay, and also, like you said, that we don't upplay it too much if it was like that kind of an exchange, but that we meet someone where they're at and that we don't downplay what they've told us, especially if we're feeling like our first reaction is, that's fine, I don't care, it's not a big deal. It's, let's say someone seems nervous and they say, I don't care. We'd say, this sounds like this felt like a really big deal to you, and I want you to know that I'm so grateful to you for sharing with me. Thank you. Being able to not downplay that is key. Not putting ourselves in the center of the circle. Another thing that can be really challenging too, right? Because we might have complicated feelings about anything that someone has shared with us, and we might feel confused or nervous or anxious or something like that. And it's important that we remember that we need to center the needs of the person who's in front of us. If we need to, we can lean on our friends, our family, our therapist, community resources for the support we need. And we should do that, so that we can in turn offer the support and affirmation that the person coming out to us needs. Below this point, you can see there's a couple bullets of some of the ways that microaggressions can appear when we are putting ourselves in the center of the circle. And what we mean by microaggressions, essentially, these are any sort of subtle, not always subtle, but so often subtle acts that discriminate against marginalized folks. And so that first one, are you going to do a real complete transition? How, when? For starters, a lot of folks do not connect with the word transition when they're thinking about affirming their own gender identities. And that can be because transition seems to apply that there is a point A and a point B, and there's a linear journey that one must be on. So for starters, that's already, it can be a very loaded and harmful term for some folks. And the others is the idea of realness and completeness already sort of implies that there is an incompleteness and a lack of realness in who this person is. And asking about how and when. I think a better approach, if it's important that we pause if we're feeling these questions come up and we ask ourselves, why do I have these questions? And then we take it upon ourselves, instead of bringing those questions into this moment with this person, take it upon ourselves to explore those on our own. And instead focus on, how can I support you? How can I be there for you? Is there anything that comes to mind that I could do to just help you belong? I think there's something in the chat.
Yes, Susan added, do you think this is just a phase?
Oh, that was word for word some of the things that I've said. Or is this because of blank experience? Is this because of this? Is this because your best friend just came out? So seeking to create some sort of environmental reason or a time-bound limitation on someone's identity can be so erasing and can so feel like a knee-jerk reaction. And I'm willing to bet that you'll probably most likely hear about these less so from fellow educators and more so from parents or other family members in a young person's life. And you might hear a young person say, this is what was said. And so by anticipating this, you can prepare how you could say, I'm like, you didn't deserve for that to be the first question. And thank you for sharing that with me. I think something that you do deserve to hear with this. Yes, Rachel.
We just warning, we have about 10 minutes.
Great. We are almost there. We are doing great. We have 2 more slides and then we are great. Yeah, these other kind of questions is that kind of young to be making this? Anything that leads to this idea that we're not really listening or accepting what this person is telling us, and that we are also just sort of naming that this person is not autonomous enough to make decisions and use language that feels authentic to who they are. And it implies that we also know them better than they know themselves, which can also feel very real and painful for adults who often do know their children really well, and no one can know you as well as you know yourself on the inside. So as educators, some quick tips that we can all be doing. One is that active listening. What is the presenting issue? What is this person seeking from me in this moment? And how can I show up for them? And if I'm unsure, how can I ask them? How can I follow up? How can I foster a culture in my educational spaces so that people know that active listening is the norm and what they deserve? 2, using affirming language, which we've practiced in abundance, and you've had so many beautiful examples already. And that is one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal. 3, intervening and practicing harm reduction. So this means when you witness someone engaging in a microaggression, or you find that you yourself has, practicing harm reduction means we need to address that situation, whether that's pausing and correcting an individual, bringing a class on board to this is what we need to be moving forward with, or this is how we function in this space. This is the culture of our space and what it needs to be. And back pocket resources on hand. There are these 2 that can also, I'm sure we can send them out to you too. The Trevor Project and Trans Lifeline are both available 24/7, and they're powerful, confidential, private options for youth to use. I recommend having this somewhere visible, if you are allowed to, having them somewhere visible in any educational space, because at any point someone can take their phone and take a screenshot and then have that later should they be experiencing crisis and needing support. And of course, as parents, caregivers, very similar, but there's that added piece too of seeking out learning opportunities and seeking communities for ourselves. What is really key about that is I think there can often be that sense of struggle that happens within any young person, any person who is striving to support a young person. And so seeking out that community is key. And that will also enable you to ask some of those questions and work through some of those questions without putting that burden on the other person, on the young LGBTQ person in your life. I want to pause in case there are any questions. We do have 7 minutes left, so we have 7 minutes for additional questions. And in the meantime, I can leave this up here in case you want to jot down any of these websites where you can check out some more of our resources. Both of those crisis resources are also ones that you can find at keshetonline.org/youth. You can go to that page, scroll to the bottom, or you can reach out to me directly and I can send you our comprehensive list. And that list actually has even more than those 2.
Yes, we are going to send you the slideshow and the resources in the next few days.
Thank you. And if you'd like, if it would feel at all helpful for us to do anything with your school, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to be a resource in any way.
Do you give advice on how Jewish day schools can do better at being inclusive?
Not only that, we actually have a guide to LGBTQ inclusion for Jewish day schools. So I'm so glad you asked. And in addition to having that guide, which I will happily, I'm going to try to pull it up right now. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen for a moment so that I can quickly pull it up. I will share it right now in the, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the chat, so I will share it with Rachel and maybe we can get it to you. And additionally, we also have what's called a leadership project, or it's now called our Shivyon project. This is a cohort learning experience, and we typically divide it by institution. So there's a day school one, JCC one, synagogue ones, and these are organizations that then work with us and receive one-on-one coaching, can do organization-specific action plans for how to foster more LGBTQ belonging. And if you wanted to learn more about that, education@keshetonline.org. We'd be more than happy to connect with your school, your synagogue, and do this like long-lasting institutional change work.
Did have a question. Do you ever present at first event?
I am exposing myself as not an expert and saying, what is first event?
While she gets back to you, I just want to add that Gateways is actually partnering with Keshet also to do a facilitated conversation with all of the local Boston Jewish day schools in January, so that we can really talk about how schools can be more inclusive. And so it's going to be with Keshet and also with another organization, Eshel, which works with the modern Orthodox community. So we're really excited about that.
Delightful.
And first event is a transgender conference. I have not heard of it before.
That sounds phenomenal. I can't imagine none of my colleagues have before, but I'm actually going to first thing tomorrow, send it in our Slack channel and ask. I'm so glad that you asked. And if it's helpful for us to follow up with you directly, if you have some ideas or something, if you want to collaborate, we would love that. I'm so excited. I learned about a new amazing opportunity. Thank you.
It's a yearly event in January. Can we get information about what will be discussed at the meeting with Gateways?
Like a sort of like agenda of what's going to be covered in that Keshet one with Gateways?
I think so. So we know what
I can't imagine why not. I'd be happy to direct that over. I'm sure the person will probably Rabbi Micah Bakyal, who might be leading. So I'd be more than happy to pass it on. I'm sure that
correct.
we
Or you can
some sort of an outline.
Yeah, and you can feel free to reach out to me too, and I can share some information about that.
Great. And thank you so much, Tamar. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everybody. So you will get resources from Jaimie, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as the survey, which I also posted in the chat, which hopefully people can see. If not, Sharon, do you want to repost it? Because you should be able to post to everyone. We look forward.
Thank you so much.
To having you at our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you to Gateways for the future session you're leading at Keshet for our team. This was so beautiful, and we're so grateful to be in partnership with you. Thank you, everyone, for dedicating your time to this. I hope we get to cross paths again.
Thank you.
Bavakasha.